Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Munson, and I'm here with Caleb Weinhardt from also on Forge's staff. And you'll see the cover slide has Emil's name on it, and they are in Florida, which may tell you a little bit about why they are not here today because of that lovely and really scary hurricane that went through that area. So you're stuck with me and Caleb, and hopefully we will be entertaining and be able to do a good job for you all. So welcome to the webinar on surviving hate, a conversation about the preliminary findings of the survey that we conducted earlier this year. This is going to be a kind of a different style than some of our webinars. We're going to have some points of conversation where Caleb and I will have some dialogue. We'll ask you for your thoughts, and we'll see how this experiment goes, but it'll be fun. So I wanted to briefly thank our funders, the Bureau of Justice Assistance through the Department of Justice. We are always grateful for their funding and appreciate what they have allowed us to do with this research, as well as other project components. What you hear today is our opinions and not that of the Department of Justice. We welcome you to be in this space with us. We're really glad that you're here. And we welcome all of you to be here. So your knowledge, your experience, your humility, your curiosity, and all of the you-ness that you bring into this space. We also welcome your body and your spirit and your mind and all of the things that we can't see that makes you who you are. We welcome you to bring as much of that into this space as you feel comfortable. A couple of housekeeping bits and pieces. This content will be challenging at some points, and we're really aware of that. And even if it wasn't intentionally challenging, we know that sometimes this content can be really painful to hear and might tap into some emotions. Please take care of yourself, whatever that means for you. Participate in the ways that feel comfortable and safe for you. And we will follow up and send you all PowerPoints and the link to the recording so that you can watch it later if you so choose, or share it with your friends and colleagues. Just a quick bit about who Forge is for folks that are not familiar. We are a trans anti-violence organization that is national in scope. We predominantly provide training and technical assistance to victim service providers and other allied professionals across the country. We have a small amount of work that we do directly with trans and non-binary survivors of many different forms of violence, as well as the people who love and care about trans folks. A couple of our guiding principles that we always hope that you will see when we share webinar content with you all is we hope that you will see and experience a trauma-informed approach to the work that we do and the work that we share with you. And I know that that is sometimes really difficult when we're talking about data in particular, or really charged topics like hate violence. Another guiding principle is to be empowerment-based. So we do hope that you will see and experience some of the ways that trans communities and providers can be really empowerment-based in terms of what you take away from here and how we share the information with you. We're also really aware that both of those things, being trauma-informed and empowerment-based, need for us to have a cultural responsive lens underneath it all. So we know that not all communities within the trans community, not all providers who are of a certain discipline have the same experiences or the same knowledge or the same skills or the same needs. So it's a little bit about kind of the guiding principles and a little bit about who we are. The agenda for today is pretty simple. We're going to talk a little bit about the survey that we did, kind of like laying out what we did and how we did it. We'll look at the results, and we're only sharing a very small little bits and pieces, some highlights of those results. We'll kind of have those conversational moments throughout. And again, we're going to encourage you and ask you to participate in the chat if you're comfortable and able to do so. And we'll talk a little bit about what comes next. So I wanted to share with you this quote from Dee Dee Waters, who we've shared it at several webinars, but it's a really, really wonderful quote. Dee Dee says, "It gives me hope to see so many trans folks thriving and changing the narrative around us being statistics. We are part of the demographics that make America better simply because we exist. And she is so, so, so right on about that. So this webinar is going to share some statistics about the violence that trans folks have experienced and do experience, and the resulting mental health impacts and many other impacts that folks who've experienced anti-trans hate violence have experienced. So I'd like us to hold that and what Dee Dee is sharing with us in that same space together. Both can exist at the same time. I'd also like to encourage you to ground yourself, recognizing that we're here together, that together we're stronger, and all of those good cliched statements. But we are in this together, and we know that we're all interconnected in the work that we do, however we're connected to this work or our communities. So I'm going to turn things over to Caleb, who is going to share with you a little bit more about the work that we did this past year.
All right. See if I can change the slide. There we go. So first, we want to offer a huge thank you to Doctors Greg Stewart and Ryan Shorey, who've been our partners in this research. We know them as Brian and Greg. They have just been really fantastic to work with. This is a photo from Pride Fest last year, I think, and you can kind of tell the kind of energy they bring, along with their really extensive research knowledge. Yes, I agree. The photo is adorable. So huge thank you to Ryan and Greg, and also everyone who participated in this study. All right. So the process of developing this study really started in our historic partnership with Ryan and Greg. We've worked with them on several other studies, and we've really seen how committed they are to understanding trans communities and filling the gaps in research that we're seeing. This also came out of seeing a really overt rise in anti-trans hate. This is something we're seeing in our work lives, in our personal lives, in the legislation and culture around us, really kind of in every aspect of life. So in creating the survey itself, we adapted some existing measures and developed new measures that feel most accurate to the language that trans communities are using, knowing that's something that is constantly changing. So for example, we used some measures that are kind of standardized and have been used in a lot of studies around mental health, substance use, and those are things we can compare to other studies, but then we have some other measures like around hate violence that we created or adapted. Those are a little bit more difficult to compare. So we went through several different iterations of the survey, and that was approved by the Institutional Review Board, at University of Wisconsin. The next three stages of this kind of go together. So we started doing outreach on social media. We had flyers, using our newsletter to kind of get the message out to trans community, to encourage people to take the survey. We use the language of framing this as adverse experiences rather than hate violence specifically, because that might have a big impact on who's taking the survey. One thing we'll talk about later is a lot of people didn't recognize their experiences as hate violence. So that already might discourage people from taking the survey if they don't feel like it applies to them. We also wanted to give folks context about the difficult content of the survey. What we saw in response was a lot of hate comments on social media. This was kind of overwhelming, and I think at one point we had over 600 comments that we had to remove on Facebook or some other platform. So that was really striking, what people were seeing when they saw the survey. So that might also be an impact on who's participating. Despite that, though, we had over 1,000 people who participated, which is pretty incredible. Trying to change the slide. There we go. So some really amazing things. Again, over 1,000 people participated over a 6-week period. This was a 1-hour-long unpaid study, so it was really generous of folks to offer their time and experiences. We learned so much from everyone who participated, and what we're sharing today is kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more that we'll get into, and we hope to share later. We're so immensely grateful to everyone who participated. We also had some limitations. This was a convenience sample, so it was whoever saw the post on social media and had the time and they have a device, they have internet access to be able to participate. For some different demographic reasons too, we're not able to compare our results to a national sample. Part of that was that our sample was mostly white, which means we can't generalize our findings to our whole community. It's a sample, a small subset of our community, and not the whole community. Another limitation was that because we adapted some of our measures, we can't compare all of those against other samples in existing research. Some of those measures are standardized and we can, others we can't. So this is just kind of an overview of who responded. There's a lot more that we can get into. Overall, we had 1,075 participants, which is great. We had an age range of 18 to 85 with an average age of 30. Like I said before, majority was white, so we had 87% white respondents. 96% of our sample identified as something other than straight, so there are a lot of different sexual orientations folks could have selected. 96% not straight. 15% of our sample had never been to college. 73% are currently employed full-time or part-time. And 71% identified as having some kind of a disability. So we offered an open text box for folks to share their gender identity. And we received so many different responses that they don't fit on this slide. So just, I think we were talking about this before, maybe 400-ish different gender identity responses. So that is just an incredible amount of diversity. And we also asked folks to share in like currently and in the past, different words that they used for their identities. So there was a lot of diversity there too. For the simplicity of presenting the results, we asked folks to select all from this list. So it's a very simplified list that doesn't capture that full complexity. But notably, majority of folks who were taking the survey identified as non-binary. So that's 62, 63%. There were a lot of different identities that fall under that umbrella too. So 71% of folks reported having a disability. Of those who shared what kind of disability they had, 65% had a mental health disability, 66 were neurodivergent in some way, and 55% had some kind of physical health condition or disability. On average, folks were reporting having 3.3 disabilities. I'm sorry, there's some background noise. I hope you aren't hearing that. So this is really striking. It wasn't that people are just having one condition that impacts their daily life, but on average having 3 or more. So that's really a lot that folks are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. This is a quote from one of the respondents who had 10 different diagnoses. They said, "I have a very difficult time functioning as a person oftentimes, and I'm likely in pain at any given moment. I am still happy to be alive, as there is beauty in my fight and struggle." So the takeaway from these responses is really clear. Intersectionality matters. This is a quote from Dominic Evans, who is a transgender filmmaker and disability activist. He says, "As long as trans disabled people like me exist, disability issues are trans issues, and trans issues are disability issues." So Michael's going to share more about hate violence experiences, but we're seeing that people are experiencing hate for a lot of different reasons, a lot of intersecting reasons. And some of those are really baked into our current economic and cultural structures. One of the quotes from a respondent was, "Universal basic income, universal housing, high quality, accessible healthcare, and the disillusion of the police. We are so often forced to endure anti trans bigotry because of the economic system we live in is cruel and coercive. Only the wealthy have the freedom to choose different housing, a different job, a different doctor. So these are things that would need to change in order to achieve justice. And you can really see how connected these many different issues are. On the same topic of how do we achieve justice, another participant shared, decolonizing academia, decolonizing our space. There's no way to confront transphobia without also confronting racism and colonization. Gender was a tool of colonizers to oppress Indigenous communities. That needs to be understood in order to educate the world in trans folks. And I'll pass things back over to Michael.
Thanks, Caleb. So we're going to talk a little bit about the findings. Caleb shared some of those findings with you as kind of just laying out kind of the big picture of the survey. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail about what we found. So it probably doesn't surprise anybody that's here, because you're interested in this topic. What we did find was an overwhelming amount of hate violence that people were experiencing. Again, like Caleb mentioned, we didn't bill this as a hate violence survey. This was, a survey that people were taking about, mental health issues and coping and pretty generic things. So they didn't know going into it that we were going to really be asking about hate violence. So as you can see on the slide, when we looked at our respondents, 95% of folks that were responding had experienced at least one hate crime. And of those that experienced a hate crime, many of them experienced hate crimes repeatedly. So, and many different forms of hate violence. And we're going to break down some of those forms of hate violence in a second. But the average number of types of hate crime that 95% experienced was around 6, so 5.7578 different types of hate violence. Again, that's really profound. So it's not that someone is having one hate violence experience or hate crime experience, and it was a one and done. Not that I'm not minimizing a person that just has one experience, but many people are experiencing many times with many different types of harm. Before I share some of the data heavy slides, I really want to just remind us all that when we're looking at data can be really mind numbing. It can be really powerful in good ways or bad ways, or however you perceive it. It can be influential in some way. And it's, I think, really important for us to remember that when anybody is experiencing a form of violence or form of harm, it's one person too many. So the stats that we're sharing today are not telling the story of somebody. It's not sharing the whole of their experience. That's partly why we're using some of the quotes from the survey, so that you can see not just the numbers, but the totality, or more of the totality of the humanness of the experiences that people are having. Again, the numbers matter far less than the reality that hate violence and anti-trans harm is happening to people. So we asked about a lot of different things. And what I'm going to show you right now is a division of two different slides. So the first one is about kind of threats and harassment, things that were not physical in nature. And then the next slide will show you some physical ramifications of the types of harm people experienced. So when we look at the types of harm that were threats or harassment, you can see that some of the highest numbers were around anti-LGBT slurs or insults. And I think this is really important. This is about a bunch of trans people that are taking this survey, and our society is really anti-gay, anti-lesbian, anti-trans too. But sometimes the insults that people are making, they don't recognize how to I don't want to say accurately target trans people, because they certainly are targeting trans communities, but they're using language that's gay and lesbian focused. I just think it's an interesting experience that people are having, and how confusing and frustrating that might be to folks that may not identify as gay or lesbian when they're hearing those things, and that compounded effect of hearing those things. I probably just talked myself into a hole there, but hopefully you understand a little bit about what I'm meaning, that sometimes the slurs are not about our current identity, but they can still be really painful to hear, and they're intended to be harmful, even if they aren't about our current experience or identity. Some of the other pieces of threats and harassment that people experienced were verbal sexual harassment. I think a lot of us expect to see that as something that would be a threat or a harassment oriented topic. People also experienced a lot of anti-trans insults, so directly being about trans identities or trans experiences. So not just the LGBT, but really specific about transness. Many people did experience threats on social media. Like Caleb mentioned, we had a lot of anti-trans hate violence on the post that we were making just promoting this survey. But trans folks are experiencing threats and harassment all the time on social media. A lot of non-trans people are as well. But when somebody is known to be trans, is out as trans, they're receiving a lot of those messages. People were also receiving a lot of threats of physical assault or threats of violence. And it's hard to start to differentiate a little bit between what's a threat that doesn't go anywhere and the really anticipatory responses that people are having when somebody makes a threat against them. I mean, we all respond when somebody threatens us. And that can be really scary. And we're going to talk a little bit about that level of hypervigilance and that fear that a lot of trans community members are feeling. People also reported that they were getting texts or emails or calls that were threatening in nature. And people also noted that they were being threatened with a weapon. So it wasn't necessarily that they were in person with somebody and a weapon was present, but they were being threatened of harm with a weapon. Those are just a few of the ways that people are experiencing threats or harassment. When we move and look at the physical violence that was happening that people reported, again, what's on the slide is only just a few of the types of physical violence that we asked about and that people reported. As you can see, the highest number here is about people that were physically attacked. And that can mean lots of different kinds of things, being pushed or grabbed or choked, lots of different kinds of things within that. We also included here, which could be seen as a threat, being chased or followed with an intention of harm. So people that were literally being chased or followed on the street or in some other location. It's also experienced by many people. A lot of folks experience property damage. So it might not have been physical harm to their bodies, but damage to their car, their apartment, any part of their belongings that were harmed. A significant amount of trans folks were experiencing objects being thrown at them. That could be a beer bottle, it could be a piece of paper, it could be any kind of object thrown in a way that feels threatening, feels harmful. Lower in the percentage, but not lower in the impact, were people that were choked or strangled. And we pulled that specifically because a lot of our work is in sexual violence and intimate partner violence. And we know that choking and strangulation is a huge part of many people's experiences with sexual assault and intimate partner violence. So it was interesting for us to bring that forward and look at what is happening around hate violence that may or may not have been connected to sexual violence. And then the last piece of data on this slide is how many folks were attacked with a weapon. So 6% of folks were attacked, and there was a weapon present in that attack. So this is just a partial snapshot of what people were experiencing around physical violence. We did ask specifically about sexual violence, and we kind of pulled this one out of the other forms of data. And this data is really consistent with a lot of other data that we know and we have. So 59% of our sample had been forced to participate in an unwanted sexual act or were touched sexually in ways that they didn't want to be. So it's certainly over half, and that, again, is what we're seeing with other research. Caleb, are you willing to read this quote?
Experiences with violence and threats of violence were distinctly based on gender identity and expression, because most, but not all, explicitly involved language that directly and indirectly connected my identity to their violent acts. All instances of domestic violence from partners and ex-partners had a gender identity component. It was always a factor and was plainly presented as such.
Thanks, Caleb. So you can see with this quote that, there's a lot of intersections. We're seeing intersections all through the data that we collected. So there's domestic violence along with hate violence, along with identity. There's a lot of things that get mixed together, which makes healing a lot harder, as well as just kind of understanding what is going on when something happens. We asked about experiences about people that were experiencing job harassment and hate violence related to that. Caleb, I'll read the first one, and if you can read the second one. So, first quote says, "I work as a delivery driver. I've been threatened by customers." So that kind of I don't want to say it's not personal, but it's that kind of not necessarily intimate, but like you're forced to interact with somebody, and people are experiencing that hate violence when they're in that transactional relationship at work.
And this next one is referring to incidents of violence on the job. They said some of this is just part of the normal customer service work experience and has happened to my coworkers and purely because of where we work.
And that's a really sad statement too, that this person views it as just a normal part of customer service. It says a lot about our culture and our country, transness or not transness involved with that, just how people treat each other, and what kind of social norm there is about how people think they can talk or be with each other. So this is a point in time where Caleb and I would like to have a kind of a little bit of a conversation together and then ask you all some of your responses or your thoughts. So Caleb, do you want to start us out with like how you're processing this information? So like what we talked about, how are you processing it?
Somebody left a comment in the chat that I want to grab because it feels
Yeah.
really relevant. Someone said, to me, I see our trans folks trying to warn the rest of the world of the violence that will soon be theirs. We are being given a sacred opportunity to address this where it is before the tsunami gets more inland and affects more insulated communities. And I really love that because Michael and I were talking before about how sometimes the data about hate violence feels really obvious. And it's like, yeah, we knew that. I think to a lot of trans folks, it feels like it's a confirmation of what we already know or assume. But then to other people and other researchers, maybe it can feel it's unexpected or even more striking. And that I think that comment really speaks to that. Is it's you know trans folks are aware of this a lot of the time, not everyone, but and trying to share that, and it's so powerful to have the data to kind of back that up to share it with other communities.
Yeah, that's a really, really beautiful quote in the chat. Thank you for sharing that. And Caleb, thank you for bringing that forward because it's just, that is so spot on. And yeah, that's really spot on. And Caleb, what you just mentioned too is like, I think we as a trans organization that works in anti-violence, this data was really confirming to us. But, we presented this data at the NCVC conference in Portland a couple weeks ago. And, it was a room full of providers. I don't know if there were any trans people in the room, but I think they were surprised by this data. They looked at it and went, oh my gosh, this is really, a big deal. Of course, it is a big deal, but I think we sometimes get numbed to the fact that these are really high numbers. And the rest of the world that's not paying attention to trans issues, which is a substantial amount of people that are not paying attention, they might be really surprised to see and know this information. Caleb, what else jumps out at you? Or what else are you processing with this? What feels important?
I Part of it for me is we spent so long kind of narrowed with a very narrow focus on how do we develop these survey questions, and that it's hard to take a step back and kind of see the full picture. And so it's really helpful to see. I'm seeing people in the chat commenting about um, how the threats of violence have made allies withdraw support. Um, just really like all of the ways that people are seeing this show up in their work. Um, it's really powerful. And for me to see that outside perspective, I think.
Caleb, when you mentioned that, and I'm looking at the chat too, and it's hard to multitask with this, but this survey, we limited it to trans and non-binary respondents. But even though we limited it, people talked about the harm that was happening to providers that they were seeing, their family members. We know as an organization, and many of you know, that anti-trans violence and hate is not just affecting trans people, it's affecting, whole systems of people, everybody in the world, if people are paying attention to it. So it goes beyond this identity-based group of folks, but to those who are connected in our communities.
And we had long conversations about how to include those perspectives and ended up focusing on community only. But, parents are absolutely affected by anti-trans legislation and hate violence impacting their trans kids and family members. And there are just so many other people kind of in our networks that are involved that we weren't able to kind of capture in this survey.
I mean, this obviously points where we need to do more work, or how we can do work in ways that are, we can capture people's experiences effectively. Because, like Caleb mentioned, parents are, one group of folks. We know that healthcare providers are really affected in almost half the states, if not more, in our country right now. And there's a lot of fear from healthcare providers about, can I do my work? Am I going to get arrested? Am I going to lose my license if I serve trans people? And that's true for folks that work in anti-violence fields as well, that there's some concerns that if people shelter or house trans people, that their shelter is going to get unfunded. There's a lot of things that people have concerns about that are not based on someone's individual identity, but the role that they play with folks. Caleb, did you see anything else in the chat? 'Cause I know you can multitask better than I can. Do you see anything else that's coming in the chat? And we encourage other people to write in the chat. How are you processing this information that we're talking about? What feels important from what you've heard so far?
There are a lot of good comments, and one I want to pull out especially is statistics can be linear, as it can also be oppressive when many are based on whom is reported. And then the same person said centering Black and Brown experience is crucial.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's something that was not represented enough in our sample.
Yeah. Other quotes, Caleb, that you other comments that feel like you'd bring forward? And I hope everybody can read the comments too, but
another person shared, I work at an anti-violence organization, and I literally had to report someone for listening to anti-trans rhetoric in their office.
Yeah, that's hard. It's hard. Yeah.
And then I think sometimes I forget what all counts as violence. It just feels normalized as a trans person sometimes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts and your comments. And you can obviously keep on sharing in the chat as we move along, because it's really, really important. Yeah. Why don't we move along and share a little bit more, and we'll have some more dialogue as we go on. So this is kind of the findings part 2. So we asked people about who they told after they'd experienced violence, hate motivated violence. And this is who they told voluntarily. So, it's not that somebody walked in after an experience, and so they told that person. But these are people. Who did they choose to tell? And at some point. And it's not any surprise that a lot of people told their friends. They told a romantic partner. Those are the two most common people that people chose to tell, which makes a lot of sense. About half the folks told a mental health provider, which is also great if folks are seeking mental health or can afford to seek mental health, or are not being traumatized by mental health providers. So that's great. And we were also confirming in our data here that very few people voluntarily told the law enforcement or police in their community. So only 7% told police or law enforcement voluntarily. Again, we're seeing this with other studies. And again, this was a confirming piece of data here, rather than something that was a surprise, at least to us. Caleb, can you read this, please?
There always needs to be a safer space for people to be able to express their issues and the things that have happened to them without feeling like they're going to be victimized all over again.
Thank you. Again, just another quote that reminds us of the reality of what's happening for folks. So I shared with you before about like who shared and who they shared with in a voluntary sort of way. And a lot of times people don't tell. And there's a lot of reasons why people don't tell. And it's perfectly fine to tell people or to not tell people or to tell certain people and not other people. So there's absolutely no judgment or shame or anything coming forward with this. So I just wanted to be really clear that when people don't tell, there's usually a reason, and it's perfectly okay to not tell. The challenge becomes when people don't tell because they're afraid of what would happen. And we saw that when we asked, well, why didn't you tell somebody? And so we kind of box these into four different groups. And the first one, people wanted to forget. They wanted to deal with it on their own. They wanted or needed to focus on other things. They had to go to school. They had to go to work. They had to keep a roof over their head if they already had one. So they needed to focus on other things. So they didn't want to tell somebody because that might, stir things up. It might cause them to not be able to stay focused on those things or not be able to forget. A lot of folks were really afraid of not being believed or having other folks not understand what they went through. And they didn't want other people to worry. So this constellation of like, what do other people think? Are they gonna affirm and confirm and have compassion and be, good with me when I share this data with them? Or are they going to blame me or cause harm to me if I share my stories with them? Other folks said that they didn't tell because they felt ashamed. They thought that they would be blamed for what happened to them, or that it wasn't serious enough. It was just whatever it was that happened to them, that they felt that people would minimize or it wouldn't be taken seriously. So some of these things we're seeing with any types of crime or victimization, but these were specific to people responding to why they didn't tell around a hate motivated crime. The last box is, kind of reinforcing why so few people don't talk to police. So few people, yeah, don't talk to police. So they were worried that police would not come, would not help, or that nothing would be done if they did tell somebody. So, why should I go through the emotional pain of telling somebody and then they won't do anything? So those are just a few of the reasons of why people didn't tell. All of us on this call know that support matters, and support can look a lot of different ways to different people. So telling somebody and getting support from who somebody tells is really important, but there's a lot of other ways that people can get support. A lot of us that work within the trauma field know that connection really, really helps with healing and with moving to a different place that's not quite so painful. We also know things like re-victimization is linked to higher rates of post-traumatic stress and depression. So when we can have support, hopefully we are not getting re-victimized when that support is happening, because re-victimization is not happening just by people that are intending to cause harm, but it can be caused by helping professionals and people that are trying to support folks. This survey shows that people are not getting the support that they need or that they want, and they're often being pushed or punished for bad things that happen to them. So we heard many times throughout people's responses, their write-in answers, that they were being harmed, they were being blamed, they were being told really horrible things when they shared what happened to them. Greg, one of our academic partners, said, "This is unsurprising, but very devastating. All the things that I might have feared to be true seem to be true." So again, kind of this surprise a little bit by him, but also knowing in his gut that these things were true for folks. Caleb?
I get called slurs based on my gender and sexuality on at least a weekly basis. I live in a dense urban area and encounter hostile people frequently as I live my daily life. Multiple times, people have threatened to attack me and follow me, and even attempted to push me onto subway tracks just on my commute to work without even exchanging any words, simply because I look queer. There is a degree to which this has become normalized in my life. I have lived with anti-LGBTQ hate for my entire life, and at a certain point, it becomes background noise to living.
Thanks, Caleb. So, I mean, that reflects some of what was said in the chat too about how for some people it just becomes a normalized reality that this violence is happening. These things are happening around us. So sometimes it's hard to figure out, do we come forward? Do we want to get support when it just feels like this is just our standard? It's our baseline for existence.
The assaults perpetuated by authority figures and those in positions of power over me have left the longest lasting damage. About cops and doctors.
So it makes total sense that when people in authority cause harm, that can really, really make a profound impact. That doesn't minimize what the harm impact can be from people other than those in authority, but there is a difference in flavor with those that are in authority that are causing harm. We asked a bunch of questions about depression, and we used a couple of validated scales, like Caleb mentioned. We tried to use as many as possible, and one of the depression scales that we used was the Center for Epidemiological Studies depression scale, it was the CESD-10. And of our respondents, 82% scored a possibly depressed on that index. And Greg, who is just really enthusiastic and really out there about his emotions. When we were talking one day and we had this recorded, and I was just like, we have to use this quote in our presentations or our trainings. But Greg said, "That's not high. That's fucking high. Fucking devastatingly high." So, Greg, who works as a mental health provider within mental health fields, is used to seeing a lot of data that shows high rates of depression. And Greg was just floored by the score that our survey respondents ended up with as an average around depression. So, we can take that for what it is. There's a lot of depression within trans communities, and there's certainly a lot higher depression rates for folks that have experienced hate violence. So Caleb, we're gonna have another convo about this, and folks that are listening, start to share, please, in the chat. What stands out to you? What does this mean for our work? And our work can mean Forge's work, the work that you all are doing, who are attending. So Caleb, what stands out for you about what we're talking about?
I mean, I keep coming back to how we see this show up in our work, and we have slightly different roles, and so I am doing a lot of the social media facing stuff, and I see that the hate violence all the time, and it is something that folks in our community are seeing regularly too. Um, and it makes me think about those places where people are seeking community and connection, knowing that's supportive and healing, where they're also being exposed to hate, um, and how we can kind of minimize that. Um, and I don't know that there's an easy answer for that, but it is absolutely something that's impacting people every time they step outside, every time they look at their phone for news, for connection. It's really powerful.
Yeah, it is. Okay, what you just said is so important that people oftentimes go online in social media platforms because that's where they find connection and support and community and healing and engagement, and they feel alive and great and wonderful. And then they also are experiencing harm in those platforms. So, it's this duality of just like, how can I get the support and connection that I need, and how can I like not see the harm that people are slinging around? And it's a really big challenge. I mean, both for individuals and for organizations about what do we do about that? And that's tough. Caleb, have we found any strategies? I know you said that we don't really have strategies. Have we found strategies for how to deal with it as an organizational level, some of that harm that's being caused?
I mean, we do have strategies. They're not necessarily the perfect strategies, but I mean, one of those is kind of splitting up the work as we try to hide or remove as much of that, like very outward facing hate as we can, so that people who are looking for resources or community are not seeing that as much as possible. Um, and some platforms make that easier and some make it harder. Um, and somebody else in the chat, and there are a few comments I'd love to share, but somebody else, it sounds like, has a similar experience. I do the social media at my work and had to keep hiding comments from the same person who kept harassing the online page whenever we had a post positive about LGBTQIA plus
Yeah,
people. That is absolutely what we're seeing too.
yeah, yeah. Any other comments related to that in the chat, Caleb?
Yeah, somebody shared around what does this mean for our work? The work is to dismantle for me. I need to show up radically so change can be embraced. Authentically is not easy when the world is systemically winning as we continue to buy into the ideologies that support Eurocentric violent values.
It's powerful. It's really powerful. One of the things that I was thinking about that we didn't share yet or here in this webinar is we asked people how they were coping with what was happening to them. And it was amazing to me and wonderful in many ways that people had strategies that seemed to be totally opposite from each other. So, for example, some people were like, if I'm going to go out, whether it was to be social or wherever, I'm going to drink or do drugs. And other people were like, if I'm going to go out, I am not going to drink. I am not going to do drugs. So, like this kind of like, how clear do I want my head, or what do I need to be like in my brain so that I can go out in the world? We had other people that were like, I'm buying a gun because I'm experiencing hate violence. And other people like, I am not having a gun in my house or in my space because of this. Like some just really opposite ways that people ended up trying to feel safer or cope with what was going on for them. So I found that really, really interesting. And it's something that continues to stand out for me in thinking about how do we help people cope with what's going on with them. How can we be open with the strategies and the kind of the multiplicity of what is in front of people? And a lot of that's about harm reduction, and a lot about it is just about listening to what people need and what they want. Caleb, do you have other things about kind of what does this mean for our work? I know you mentioned, kind of the social media angle of it. Does it have other implications for you about what we're doing at Forge? Or any projections about what other people might be needing to look at?
Well, I mean, we've talked about sometimes this idea of how to be trauma informed while we're talking about hate violence and how almost impossible that feels to know what that means. Um, and when we're, sharing the results of this survey with different audiences, how do we, not re-traumatize people, and how do we, share this really important data in a way that doesn't cause more harm? Um, and I think that's still something we're trying to figure out what that looks like, and hearing from people is really important to that. I'm trying to also read through and really appreciating all of the things that folks are sharing.
Caleb, as you're sorting through those and thinking about what you want to share verbally with that, picking up on that line about being trauma informed, one of the things that I've thought about and we've had conversations as a staff about has been when there's new types of violence. And it's kind of weird to say that, is there a new type of violence? Is there a new type of harm? And I think there is. I think we think there is. There's some different strategies that people are using to cause harm, some of the state-sanctioned hate, some of the legislation that's happening. How do we become more trauma informed when the violence is different? So is trauma informed approach like universal? Can we just, like layer it on the work that we do? Or do we need to start thinking about like, well, what does this mean? How do we need to create spaces, create resources, literally be with people in ways that might be different than what we used to do when we were believing that we were trauma informed? So are the same things true, or do we need to maybe do something different? And I think we need to do something different. And it's a really continual learning process for us. And I hope it is for all of us of how can we be better with the people that we serve. Kev, what else do you see in the chat, or do you have any responses to what we were just talking about?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many great ones here. And one that I love is I actively embrace the mess. The mess is the medicine. And that's like like this whole process is so messy. And that's how we learn, and how we learn to be trauma informed, and what that means, and what we need to know more about. So thank you for that.
Beautiful.
And then there are a couple that are really interesting about protesting. We don't go into it a lot here, but we did ask about protests and how people feel safe and or not safe. And somebody shared, it's been so weird protesting over the past year. I feel safest online, but being in a group of protesters feels safe on so many levels. The solidarity on the streets has been healing.
Yeah.
And then kind of the duality somebody else shared. I'm going to a safe protesting event later today, and even I'm scared, as I know I'm in just as much danger as the group I'm meeting up with. The numbers help, but we're also scared.
Yeah. Those are fantastic. Thank you, Caleb, for reading those, and thank you everybody for contributing so many thoughts. There's just like so much here, and for those of you who can multitask, I mean, read what's there because it's just there's some really, really powerful things that you've all shared. So thank you very much. So I'd like to remind us to move and breathe and stretch and sip. And if Emil was here, they would do the magical, wonderful thing of moving their body. And so I encourage you, if you need to stand up or sit down or lay down or move, please do that. If you need to breathe, if you're not breathing, we value breathing at Forge. So I encourage you to breathe or stretch or take a drink of water. Um, find a way to kind of refresh yourself, and we're going to move on a little bit, but I know that what we've just talked about is really intense and really hard to talk about. All right. So we've talked a lot about social media. We're going to have this kind of like part three of the findings. So just a little bit about the impact of social media. Again, it's not going to be a surprise to those of us that are here that a lot of trans folks are seeing anti-trans content, and it has a pretty significant effect on people when they see it. It's kind of hard to not feel, some moderate or significant level of an effect when people are seeing negative or anti-trans comments on their social media. The good thing, I don't know that there's a good thing in this, but about a third of the folks reported only minor or neutral a negative effect from seeing anti-trans content. And that I really, I'm wondering as people are sharing in the chat, like, do a lot of trans people and trans community members just kind of become numb to what's going on? So it may not have as potent of an effect for them because that's just become their baseline and their norm. We've mentioned before about legislation and how much legislation, all of us know that there's a lot of anti-trans legislation that's happening. And again, this is not a surprise to us that 83% of the survey respondents reported significant distress from anti-trans legislation. And for a lot of people, that ended up meaning that they thought about it every day. They thought about it a lot. They were worried about it. How would it impact their life? Are people saving up hormones because they're worried that they're not going to be able to access hormones later? Are people making decisions now? I mean, these are projections of what kind of came out of the responses that people had, were some of the actions that people were taking as a result of that significant distress they were feeling. So I'm sure that many of you have seen some of the themes that are coming out of this, and some of the themes are really around avoidance, avoiding what happened, either avoiding situations of where there might be harm, not that they can all be avoidable or knowable, but also avoiding thinking about it, working with it, reflecting on it, or seeking support around it. We also see a theme around connection, that people do want connection with other people, even though that sometimes is really difficult to find or to seek or to actually receive. The other theme that we're seeing is that people are seeking information. People want to know more, and they might want to know more about what space seems safe from other community members. They might be seeking information about how do I safety plan? They might be seeking information about how do I support the trans clients that are coming into my agency. So those are three themes that we're seeing that are coming through the data. Let me share a little bit more about some of the impacts that we're seeing, and some of that is around avoidance. That was the first thing of those themes. A lot of folks avoided by not showing up at a place. And so 88% of folks avoided at least one location. So again, it could be like their workplace, it could be a certain road or street, it could be their place of faith, it could be a family member's house. They were avoiding at least one place. Again, out of this fear or out of anti-trans hate. A lot of people avoided more than one place. So we had an average of 4.2 places that people were avoiding. So there might be multiple places in somebody's life that people are like, this does not feel safe. This feels like there's a lot of anti-trans hate stuff going on there. I am not going to go to these places if I can help it. lots of people were engaging and were able to identify the coping strategies that they were using in their life. And I always find it fascinating and wonderful when people can say, hey, this is how I'm coping. I know how I'm coping, and this is how I'm doing it. So some of the things that people said, and these were all things that 80% or more of respondents brought up in some way, that we kind of analyzed in some very specific ways. We mentioned a couple of these before, but like a lot of people are distracting themselves or concentrating on what's next. They're focusing on something other than thinking about the trauma that happened to them. Some people pretended that nothing happened. Pretend is a strong word, but went along with nothing happened. I'm going to forget about it. It's going to be in my past. A lot of folks isolated by choice or were isolated as a result of what was happening or the social or cultural construct of their lives. So isolation is something that we saw a lot, even though people did want to have connection with folks. Many folks avoided the news. It's again, this is one of those obvious things. A lot of anti-trans stuff is happening and it's showing up on the news. So people are avoiding print-based news, TV news, social media news to try to cope with what's going on. A lot of people used or expressed their emotions. So that could be through crying or screaming or laughing or using humor. So any way that they could express things, that was really important to a lot of people as a coping strategy. People wanted to spend time and did spend time with their friends or with their animals. That human connection was really, really important for a lot of people in coping with what happened. And then the last couple of things are people talked about making art or participating in activism. So taking an active role in either directly healing from what was going on for them or what had happened to them, or creating something beautiful or something that's challenging or something, whatever. Creating something can be a really, really powerful tool in healing from trauma. When we ask people about their safety strategies, this is just a small fraction of what came out in the answers. Um, a really primary answer, though, for people's safety strategies were around being vigilant about their surroundings. And I think, many of us in our world, many of us are living as within marginalized communities. We're aware of what's going on. We're aware of, where we are in the world, about who's around us, about where the exit might be, around a lot of things that we are either taught to be vigilant about or have learned that we have to be vigilant about because of what our experiences have been in life. So a lot of folks report that their safety strategy is to intentionally be vigilant and aware of what's around them. Other people talked about presenting their gender in more conforming ways as ways that they could be more safe in the world. Um, Again, we didn't ask if these safety strategies provided them with more safety or if this is what felt like they would be more safe. And Caleb, do you remember if we asked specifically if they were feeling more safe or if they actually felt that this created more safety?
I don't think that we did. I think it was specifically around what strategies
Mhm.
do you use to feel more safe. So that would be a great thing to look at in the future about what
It
of
would be.
these actually help people both feel safer and experience fewer
Yeah.
instances of hate violence.
Thank you for the reminder. There's so much data that we had that sometimes it's hard to remember exactly what the question was that we asked. A couple of other things that people used for safety strategies or implemented in their lives were, again, kind of dissociating, not thinking about it. And that was a safety strategy for a lot of people. Um, a lot of times people researched a place before they went. So it could be about what is somebody's policy at an agency? It could be, is there a gender inclusive or gender safe bathroom for them? They also other people reported that they wanted to get recommendations of safe places to go. So you could either research on your own what those kind of places are that might be safe or might be okay to go to, and getting recommendations from their friends or colleagues about places that would be safer to go. And one of the things that I found interesting, and I've brought this forward a couple of times when we've shared data, is that one way that people stayed safe was to avoid eye contact. So just, not kind of keeping your head down and not connecting with people helped people feel a little bit more safe. Caleb, could you read this?
I monitor my gender expression depending on who I expect to see and where I expect to be.
Again, this is somebody who's very vigilant about where they're going, where they are, and what and how they choose to express their gender. So again, that vigilance and that preparedness and thinking ahead, it can be really, really, really exhausting. Even if somebody is just getting up and wanting to go to the grocery store or going outside to get their mail, that level of vigilance is really, really exhausting. Before I turn things back over to Caleb, one of the other impacts is around anger and despair. Um, a lot of times we hear from folks about kind of wanting to be a perfect survivor or a good survivor. And that means like, we're not supposed to be angry. We're not supposed to show despair. We're supposed to have hope. We're supposed to be nice and kind and all of those good things. And that's not the reality for a lot of folks. So as providers, can we listen to people who are angry? Can we listen to people who are raging about what's going on? Can we listen to people who are mad at us or the system? So again, like some of what came through in our survey was these comments that were about anger and despair. So a couple of comments that people wrote as quotes. First one is, there isn't anything that can be done since the overwhelming majority of people hate trans people. Again, this is what this person believed in their life and who was around them, is that the majority of people hate trans people. Another person wrote, I don't know, I wish cis people cared. So again, just kind of this reality of who is around them and wishing that people cared. And the third quote really kind of taps into that anger component of this. This person said, for people to allow us to be angry and understand our anger, not to censor us, to actually listen to what we need them to do to help us as allies. So again, allowing people and welcoming people and encouraging people to bring their full set of emotions into the space that they're joining us with. Yeah. Caleb.
So what we're seeing overall is that this culture of hate is really prevalent, and it's impacting people in almost every area of their life. And what we can do in all of our individual roles is working to develop alternative systems that people can access justice and safety and bravery, as folks are sharing in the chat too. One of the big takeaways from this was that people believed that nothing would be done if they reported an instance of hate violence to law enforcement, to these formal systems. And they also did not like or trust our criminal legal system. And for some people, that just does not feel like an option whatsoever. For safety reasons, for past negative experiences, that's just not on the table. So in response to that, we need to be able to develop hate prevention and response efforts that are outside of law enforcement and outside of our criminal legal system. Let's see if I can switch slides here. We asked folks about what is justice, and that's kind of a broad question, what justice means to them. So here are some of those responses. Never seen it, wouldn't know. I'm not sure. The haters need to come around, but I don't know how that happens. It's hard to say what justice means to me because I don't believe in our justice system. The carceral/criminal justice system has harmed trans people more than helped. And so I don't even believe that justice is something we have in this country. So we would love to hear from all of you. There's, so much going on in the chat, and it's all wonderful. And we'll come back to some of those too, but looking specifically at justice, how do you build justice into your work? And then this other piece of what alternatives to the existing system do you use? Alternative ways to access justice, alternative options. Someone shared, all this is coming from a linear perspective, and I would love to see a more Indigenous point of view. Our Earth needs justice too. Yeah, absolutely. Justice to me means accountability for those who are harmed to others, or harmful to others. Justice is not something that America affords to its peoples. No colonial system of redress affords us justice. Thank you. Yeah, somebody else shared a longer comment with also people in power are literally justifying and calling for violence. How are we supposed to be safe? Yeah, and that's something we saw in a lot of the responses too. Justice needs to have space to stop harm and healing. Without healing, or at least triage, there is no justice. Thank you for all of these responses. And keep sending responses, and I think I accidentally moved the slide, but we'll keep hearing those.
I'm trying to find my mouse. There we go. I really appreciate too the comments in the chat that remind us of how linear data is, how linear we might be being today, and that is a really good reminder to us to examine that and to figure out how we can share in different ways, how we can think in different ways, how we can help create healing spaces in different ways, how it's not about us, it's about all of us, and who we need to tap, who can be tapped to help in that healing process. So I know that's cryptic for folks that are not reading the chat, but just a reminder for all of us that it's more than just the harm that's happening right now. There's some systemic things that really need to be addressed. Yeah. To shift back to thinking about some really broad lessons for the field, and the field that we're referring to is anti-violence folks, folks that work in sexual assault, domestic violence, other forms of harm. These are really global and things that probably don't need saying, but we'll say them anyway. Um, so some of the lessons are an increased awareness of the high rates of trauma experiences and depression, and all of the things that we found in this survey, and all of the things that are coming forward so much in the current literature and data that's being collected. So a lot of times folks that work in certain fields have no awareness of the high levels of violence and harm that are happening against any kind of marginalized community, including trans and non-binary folks. Another lesson is really the lack of hope and how that can impact seeking support. So we know that people that are experiencing so much trauma oftentimes really feel very little hope, and it's hard to muster up any level of hope, and that's understandable. But when there's not an inkling of hope, it's really, really hard to go and seek supportive services, no matter what kind of service that is. Many trans people have experienced repeated negative experiences with services, with providers. And again, those of us who are here know that, those experiences that people have had in the past mean that people are less likely to seek services in the future. So just an awareness of that negative experiences, and how can we honor those negative experiences and really listen to folks who may need to talk about what happened to them in the past before they can access services with us now in a more productive way for that person around their current trauma. And sometimes we need to make sure that we take extra care to be trans affirming and recognize the impacts of trauma, specifically anti-trans based trauma. So how can we be extremely aware of what's going on for trans folks and work to really, really create systemic trans affirming environments? Caleb, could you read this?
More advocacy and action from cis allies. More outward opposition to transphobia from cis people. We need them to be willing to speak up for us when we aren't there or are too afraid to say anything. Right now, they're mostly complicit.
So another reminder that, we are all in this together, and sometimes it's really important for communities that are harmed to not have to be the ones that do the work. So how can our allies, how can the world, how can we support each other with what's going on? And I know that was a much more simplified way than what was written on the slide, but how can we all work together? Another quote, Caleb, please.
I would like buildings and other locations to make it clear that they are a safe place for the trans and non-binary community. I want gun control laws and bans to be enacted. I want trans and non binary people to easily change their gender marker on their ID and birth certificate, and for the gender marker to include X in all states. I would want more locations to not separate based on gender, such as housing and shelter locations. And it would also be helpful for some if healthcare clinics called for patients/clients by their last name while the patient or client is in the waiting room.
Thanks, Caleb. Again, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning about it's not just how do we respond to hate violence, it's how do we create a culture, an environment, a set of systems that are not inherently harming and traumatizing and othering. This person mentions a bunch of things, and these are just a small handful of what some of the things are that ideally would be changed systemically across the board in all different kinds of professions and locations and all of those things. So we've used this next slide on a couple of our webinars recently, and we find it really valuable and wanted to share it again with you. This is from Chase Strangio, and he writes, there's resistance that is growing, and I believe in the power of our continued ability to find and celebrate ourselves and hold our communities in love. So hopefully we can try to hold our communities in love as we're doing some of this work. And sometimes that's really, really hard to do. So another point of dialogue before we wrap up today is what we're curious about. So we'd love to hear what you're curious about in the chat. We'd like to share a little bit about what comes next for us. But Caleb, do you want to get us started with kind of what you're curious about? What this brings up for you?
So many things. One of the really big areas was looking at that 71% of folks having a disability, or most often multiple disabilities, and that's something where I think we look back and we're like, I wish we had asked questions a little bit differently, because it came up in so many different areas, like around people saying, I didn't avoid places because of protesters or because of anti-trans hate, but because of COVID, and I have a disability and it's not safe for me to be in that space. So that's one thing that I think we've talked a little bit about, could be its own study, but there's so much data there to dig into.
I'm fairly familiar with our data. Not all of it's always in my head, but Caleb, when you were sharing the slide that broke down that 71%, I was surprised again that 66% identified as neurodiverse in some way, and that's a profoundly high number. And it's like, well, I don't want to say what does that mean, but like that's just interesting, and it would be really interesting to dive deeply into that and look at what some of the responses were of folks that identified as neurodiverse versus folks that didn't identify as neurodiverse, just for one example of like breaking down those disabilities, because we did ask people if they wanted to share what types of disabilities that they lived with. And we haven't fully analyzed all of the nitty gritty of that, but it would be very interesting to look at that.
Yeah.
Are there other things that you're curious about, Caleb, that
Well, that sort of leads into like a part of that is making any future research we do accessible to the community and like really meet people where they are going to find that and want to participate. And, this was a really long survey. So I think that has an impact on who can participate. And then also we're, very limited racial diversity too. So it's like, how do we make sure that the survey is reflecting the whole community? That's something I think all of us would like to see in future research. And part of this process is figuring out what perspectives are missing and how we can expand that. Yeah.
And I know at a recent conference that we were at, we had people talking to us afterwards about some of their areas of interest, and we're obviously interested in their areas of interest too. But one was aging, and do we want to look at data of the folks that were older as well as younger? Disability was one, and also looking at Latinx or Black and Brown folks, and really thinking about what do we need to do, or what does somebody else need to do that we can help support to gather more data and to create useful strategies from that data. Caleb, what comes next? Um,
I wonder if you could share a little bit about the like other sharing out
yep.
about this data that we're doing first.
Yeah, you bet. And then let's go back and look at the chat too. But
Yeah.
so some of what we know comes next for us around this data is we're not finished kind of digging into some of the analyses. What we're sharing here today, some of the other places that we've shared, are really some overview concepts. And we really want to look at some of those relationships and comparing some of those features, identities, relationships between things to get a better understanding of things. And we'll be doing, after that kind of analysis, we definitely want to make sure that we put out a printed form of resource, and that probably will take the form of a long format guide or report. And we'll probably have some kind of tip sheet length pieces that have kind of more small components of what we learned from it. We're also very likely going to be hosting another webinar or two or three that talks about more of those in-depth areas. So, looking at some of the comparisons, we don't even know where they're going to be yet. I'm pretty darn sure, though, that one of them is going to be on disability and the relationship of disability and hate violence. So those are a couple of things that we know that we're going to do. We also have funding under the one award that this webinar is being funded under, that we have the capacity to figure out what else we need to do or we would like to do to support providers or community members who are working around anti-trans hate. Those are some of the things. Caleb, do you want to share either more about what you think is coming up that I might have missed, I probably missed, or some of what's in the chat about what people are curious about, or what might be coming next?
Yeah, there's a lot. And I wanted to come back to, there were a couple of comments earlier about, can we talk about the people who are causing the violence and why? And then another one was, is there a survey that inquires with those who commit hate crimes and violence, what their motivations for harm are? That's, a different focus from what this survey was, but it's totally like with 95% of people experiencing hate violence, there are people also doing that violence. And so that could absolutely be a future direction for another piece of where hate violence comes from and how we can prevent it rather than the impacts. But I thought that was a really interesting question.
Yeah, are there other things that you've noticed that are coming in the chat that you'd like to share out verbally?
Yeah, I see gathering research from those in the community, outside the community, and those existing on the edge of social privileges. Yeah, absolutely. And then above that, we have how do we get people to attend these events and take them seriously too? Oh, and I think that's referring to centering Black and Brown disabled innovators. Yeah, totally.
And we really know that, surveys are just one way of learning about communities. The majority of ways that we learn about communities are not through formalized surveys. I mean, listening to people comes in lots of different formats, and academic research is one way, and it's certainly it's not accessible to a lot of people for many, many, many different reasons. Distrust or not having access to a computer or a phone, lots of different reasons. So we're aware of some of those limitations and are very interested in hearing more and learning more, both about what's happening as well as what some solutions can be. Yeah. Caleb, other things in the chat that you're able to pull out? I know there's a lot of really great chat.
Yeah. Well, I would love to hear, well, this is a specific areas. Healthcare is such a barrier. Trans isn't linear. We have to discuss somehow the binary concept of whom or what mainstream considers to be trans due to passing dominance. Yeah, healthcare was definitely not a specific focus of this survey, but in a lot of other research about trans communities, one of those huge barriers.
I saw a comment. I'm sorry, go ahead, Caleb. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say I'm definitely missing things. So if there are other comments you want to bring forward, please do, because I'm going through them.
I was going to say, I'm scrolling up too, and I was really struck by one of the comments that I'd really like us all to think about, which is that safety is not real because it's relative. I think it's important to value bravery strategies. And the person goes on to say, safety is a white cis man's way of validating their power and control. That is a really, really, really wonderful thing for us to think about. It's not a wonderful concept. It's a really good thing for us to think about. And I know at Forge we have often talked about, like, safety is non-existent. We can't create a safe space. None of us can create a safe space because safety is really, it's not real. It's not the same for everybody, and we can't guarantee that. We at Forge, or we anybody. And so to think about it as bravery strategies is a really, really great reframe of that. And we certainly recognize that safety is we can flip that around and realize where there's power and control that comes out of that strategy or belief. So I really thank you for adding that comment. Yeah. Caleb, anything else that you saw that you want to bring forward?
Here are a couple more things at the end here. There's causing harm is very human. We are still good people and deserve good things. And someone else shared a quote that was, each of us is more than the worst thing we've done, from Brian Stevenson. And then another was, I love using relative terminology because it opens to change as possible. I love that.
And I think one of the things that many of us that work in or have a history in sexual violence or domestic violence is how we divide people. As you can only come into our program if you're a non-offending survivor or victim, and not recognizing that all of us are capable of harming others, and all of us are capable of being harmed or able to be harmed. And so, when we separate people out by, you can only come if you've never hurt somebody, I don't know of any person that's never hurt somebody. So it's that gradation of where we cut people off and where we draw the line. So I appreciate some of those comments that were in the chat. Right. Y'all have been really, really active in the chat. Way, way cool. Thank you. I'm so looking forward to looking at all of what you said later on. Why don't we move forward and kind of wrap up for the day, because we're close to our time. So we want to just make sure that folks know where you can find us on social media. We are on Instagram, TikTok, which we might be slowing down on, Facebook, and YouTube, which I don't consider a social media platform, but other people do. So come and find us. We love to have your connection and be connected with you there. We also encourage folks, if you're interested in more of the trainings that we've done, more of the publications that we've created, we have two different places as websites that we encourage you to come. One is our main site, which is forge-forward.org, which does house, I don't know, okay, we probably have over 100 hours of webinar content that's archived, and hundreds of pages of publications of all different formats and types to access for free. We also have a blog at trans-survivors.com, which is more intended to reach trans and non-binary survivors of different forms of crime or harm. But we've been posting a lot of interesting things, some personal reflections, some book reviews, some strategies and skills. So we welcome everybody to be in both of those spaces, but they're very different websites and different forms of access to resources. If you want to contact us, you can find us here, and we'll be sending out the slides afterwards so that you'll have email addresses and contact information. Caleb, I'm wondering if you could put the link to the evaluation in the chat, please. We really care about your feedback, and I know there's been some feedback that has come through the comments that you've made, and we take feedback really, really seriously. So if you have a moment, the evaluation for today's event is pretty darn simple, and we'd really value any comments that you'd like to make. Caleb, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to end us with today before we check out?
I don't know that I have anything to add. I'm just really grateful for all of the participation and so many ideas shared here. Thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. Thank you to our ASL folks who are always fantastic, and it's wonderful to have them be here and make at least these spaces a little bit more accessible to some folks. And I see in the chat somebody's asking, can they access the report? Not written yet, but yes, you will be notified about it as soon as it's written and out for the public. So keep an eye out for some of the things that are coming up in the future, which could be some additional webinars with greater depth or detail, as well as some of the written documents that are coming out. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. We'll stick around for a couple of minutes, and we encourage you to share with us that we're going to do this again at 7 o'clock Central tonight. So if somebody wants to come back, we will welcome you with open arms, and anybody else. So thanks, everybody, for being here.